This is my review for The House That Dripped Blood. So, The House That Dripped Blood is a horror anthology movie that was released in 1971. It's on the longer side, about 1 hour and 40 minutes, 41 minutes, and it includes, or more like it includes 4 stories about how different people met their fate in what seems to be a cursed house. The movie starts off with an inspector from Scotland Yard being tasked with solving the disappearance of a missing movie star that had recently rented the house. We see the homeowner slash landlord. I don't really remember what the guy was supposed to be, but the guy that's leasing the property out, whose name was Stoker, is seen talking to the inspector about the house's history. The way the movie works is that the landlord tells the inspector what happened to each previous renter as likely examples of what happened to the initial missing film star. While I like the idea of this and found the concept actually amazingly fun, the way it was executed wasn't the best, in my opinion. I think part of this might have just been like British filmmaking, where it's a lot more subtle than like American or Italian films, or at least American Italian horror. I wish as a viewer we would have had a little more indication of the beginning of a new story once the new stories would start. When the first story ends and the second one begins, the movie itself just keeps going. And I had to go back to make sure I didn't miss anything. The movie is much more dialogue driven when it comes to the stories and their segues, with it going to the police station briefly for a few lines of dialogue between the inspector and the landlord before the next story starts. With the movie being described as an anthology, I don't think it would be bad to just show a title on the screen when a new story starts. For reference, all of the stories in the movie were originally written by the author Robert Bloch, who also helped write the movie, if I understood that correctly. Bloch wrote many short stories that would be featured in pulp publications such as Weird Tales, actually. The first story is Method for Murder, which is about how a horror story writer and his wife rent out the house so he can gain inspiration to write his latest story. It was funny to me to see this trope of a writer escaping the city for inspiration, which was used. It was funny to see this used for inspiration in movies even back then, and how this is still used today. There are so many movies that use this trope, and it always makes me shake my head because it's not bad, but the amount of people who have stolen this idea is it's just hilarious how many people have used this idea. The author, Charles, was into writing about murder and had apparently written multiple stories about various serial killers. Once at the house, he starts to write about a serial killer named Dominic, who chokes people out after basically stalking them through the window. Charles starts to see Dominic in the house and around the area, thinking that he's losing his mind. He goes to a psychiatrist who tells him that it's just his mind playing tricks on him, that it was just the manifestations of his stories coming to life. And in a way, this was true. One night, Charles is in the house with his wife when he sees Dominic come up behind her and start choking her. He runs up to help, but Dominic vanishes, and Charles's wife tells him that he was choking her. He goes back to the psychiatrist, who doesn't even seem to care that he choked out his wife. And after this, the psychiatrist ends up being dead, choked out. I'm not sure if Charles or Dominic does this because in the movie, the psychiatrist just shows up, like he just pops up. He's dead. He's fucking dead. Later, it turns out that Dominic was real. And the secret was actually the secret lover of Charles's wife. Charles's wife was cheating on him. The lover, I guess his name was Richard, he dressed up as the character, Dominic, and their idea was to frame Charles for murdering the psychiatrist so that the wife would inherit all of Charles's royalties from his stories solely. The guy who dressed up as Dominic ends up being crazy, or at least crazier than originally thought, and he messes up the plan by killing Charles. the wife was like, "You were supposed to kill Charles. Now the police will be looking for a killer." And then, of course, she gets choked out too. I thought actually the story was pretty funny, though silly. I'm not sure if it's the way it was originally written or if potentially this was just adapted for the movie. In general, the movie isn't really scary, though it has a lot of spooky and slightly creepy elements to it. Each story has different factors of creepiness to them, with that dry British humor, which actually I like. I actually appreciate this because you're not freaking out with anxiety just to watch the movie. I view all of the stories similar to ghost stories that would be told around a campfire if you were out late at night with friends. For an opening story, I think it's all right. The way it was filmed drew me in more than the actual writing to it did. Ironically, the writing to the story about the writer was rather uninteresting. Maybe it's just that in the decades since this type of plot has been played out, so maybe I was just too jaded by the time I came across this movie. Granted, if the story was fleshed out a bit more, I think it could have been a valid movie all on its own. I could see it being like a Lifetime movie or something. Now that I think about this, I didn't write this down, but, that type of plot is something I would expect for a Stephen King movie, Stephen King would probably write about that and turn it into something about Maine, and I don't know. Have you ever seen the movie The Well? Is that what it's called? It has potential to be similar to, like, The Well from Stephen King. But anyway, back to the review. So the second story is Waxworks and the inspiration for the poster art to the movie. The main character is played by Peter Cushing, one of the horror film greats. Cushing's character moves into the house, and not long after, he comes across a wax museum. In it, he sees this wax figure of a woman who he can't stop looking at. So the owner to the wax museum is this like really freaky dude, and he talks about how the wax woman was his wife and she killed someone and then she ended up being killed. So either way, it's just clear that something freaky is going on with the wax museum. Eventually, Cushing has a friend come over to the house and the two end up at the wax museum. The friend becomes enthralled with the wax woman, and Cushing forces him to leave the museum with him. The friend acts like he's not going to go back, but he does, and his head is turned into wax. Cushing's character suffers the same fate after returning to the museum and finding out his friend's fate. The end of the story shows a young guy becoming enthralled with the wax woman, implying that the cycle would start over once again. I found this story okay, though relatively weak. And according to Wikipedia, this was originally published in Weird Tales. And even though, you can find a lot of Weird Tales, the publications to read online, majority of Robert Bloch's stories are still copyright. So even though I would love to read this for the channel, I don't know if I could read it because of copyright. So anyway, which is strange because the story is almost like 100 years old. But anyway, I found the story relatively weak. I think that when it comes to the idea of the house that dripped blood, the idea to this house that's being haunted or some type of haunted, I don't feel like the story fits in with it. What does a wax museum have to do with this evil house that people love to rent out? This wax museum is in another building in the city. What does this have to do with the evil house in the middle of nowhere? Looking back, I don't really think the story fits in with the idea of the movie, though I guess they had to put Peter Cushing somewhere, right? So the third story is Sweets to the Sweet, and was definitely my favorite in the film. Honestly, they should have made this the main story flat out. And I already wrote that down, but just thinking about this should have been the main story to the film. Really. Christopher Lee is in the story, first of all. So, of course, it's already going to be good. It has Christopher Lee, right? And he plays the overprotective father for a young girl named Jane. They move into the house, and not long after, a caretaker is hired, Anne Norton, who is a widow. Mrs. Norton was previously a school teacher, and she comes to really care for Jane, who is isolated from other children and isn't even allowed to have toys. And we're just kind of like, what's wrong with this guy? Oh my God. So, Miss Norton asks Jane's father, Christopher Lee, if she could buy the girl toys, and he allows it. But once he sees a baby doll that she bought for the girl, he freaks out and throws it in the fireplace. Jane is afraid of fire, and we, the viewer, are just left wondering why. So, of course, Jane's mother isn't in the picture, and this is, the trope where the mom is dead. So, of course, it's revealed that Jane's mother died in childbirth. When asked if he missed his wife, Christopher Lee's character states that he was glad she was dead. And we're like, oh my God. But later, we see Jane secretly reading books about witchcraft when her father and Miss Norton are sleeping at night. One night, there's a storm, and Lee's character goes to grab some candles when it's revealed that there's only 4 left. So he goes up to his daughter, demanding to know what happened to the rest of them, and she doesn't say anything. So he smacks her, and Jane runs out of the room after this. We see Jane doing things in secret, such as saving the hair from her father's razor after he shaves, and then stabbing something with pins and needles. We see her father in multiple scenes scream out in pain, though when he goes to the doctor has no idea what's wrong. In fact, he tells Christopher Lee's character that it's probably indigestion. I found this hilarious, actually, because how does something like constipation or gas explain the shooting pain in someone's arm? As said before, I appreciate the British humor in this film, seriously. Eventually, it's revealed that Jane's mother was a witch, and Jane is the same. The girl took the extra candles to make a voodoo doll of her father, and she was stabbing him over and over with pins and needles. Her father ends up in bed, incredibly sick or whatever, and someone takes, I can't remember, honestly, I think Miss Norton Miss Norton ends up trying to take the doll from Jane, and she takes the doll of wax, and she ends up throwing it into the fire by accident. And, of course, the wax doll melts, and it's implied that Jane's father dies because of this. By far, I thought that this was a great story and would have been an amazing concept to see as a film on its own. I really thought the story had a lot of potential. The concept is a great idea for what could be a potentially super scary horror movie. This one sticks out to me, and it makes the movie as a whole worth watching. I feel like this was the best story in the entire film. And the 4th and final story is The Cloak. The story was to tell what happened about the missing actor who was mentioned at the beginning of the film, Paul Henderson. But by the time we got to it in the film, I was ready for the movie to end, honestly. Henderson was supposed to be like an annoying, snooty actor who decides to go to a costume shop to find an authentic cloak for a vampire movie he was in. He ends up buying one, and it turns him into a vampire. This was the only time I've ever seen such a concept like this, where a piece of clothing makes someone a vampire and not the bite itself. In fact, Henderson wasn't bitten by any vampires at all. He'd put on the cloak in front of a mirror and have no reflection. And then later on, he goes to kiss Ingrid Pitt's character in another scene, but he ends up biting her, on the neck like a vampire. And then at midnight, he puts on the cape and he starts to fly in the air. It's implied that the man who sold him the cloak was a vampire himself and was passing on the curse to Henderson. He brings Ingrid Pitt's character back to the house one night, and he tries to show her, but when he puts the cloak on, nothing happens. It turns out that she switched it with a regular one, and so she puts on the cloak, the real one, and reveals herself to be a vampire. Apparently, there was a secret group of vampires that had been watching Paul Henderson, hoping to make him a part of them. I guess the irony about this was the fact that the character, Paul Henderson, had played vampires all the time during his acting career. And I looked this up, and I don't remember the actor's name, the guy who actually played Paul Henderson, but looking through his filmography, ironically, the actor really never played a vampire before this movie. So I thought that was like a double-sided piece of humor to the dialogue, really. So after this, though, the anthology itself ends, and we go back to the inspector from Scotland Yard. He goes to the house to investigate what could have happened to Paul Henderson, and it's revealed that Henderson was in the basement of the house, hanging out in a coffin like a vampire would, because by this point he's like actually a vampire. The inspector ends up like into a fight, and he stabs Henderson in the heart with a wooden stake, another vampire trope. And he's then killed by, I believe the inspector is killed by Ingrid Pitt's character. So we see the house up for rent, ready again, and the landlord, Stoker, is standing outside of it. He asks the audience if we figured out the mystery to the house, where it's revealed that it reacts to the heart of the person renting it. So basically, all of the people who lived in the house had bad things happen to them because they were like bad at heart, I guess. The movie ends after that. Overall, I think it's a good movie, and I did enjoy it. There are parts that dragged on a bit too much for me, and honestly, I don't think all the stories needed to be in the movie. I really don't. I think that we could have gone without the first or second stories in order to save the interest of the audience. I think that Christopher Lee's story was the best and actually blew the main idea about the missing actor out of the water. I didn't even care about a missing actor after Christopher Lee's story. But like I said, if Christopher Lee's in something, of course his stuff's going to be good. I actually do recommend the film, though. I found it really entertaining. Despite the stuff I don't like, I think it is worth a watch. I think that people would find it interesting, and even with the parts I didn't like, it has some pretty big names in it, such as Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, and on top of that, we see Ingrid Pitt in this movie, who would later on be in The Wicker Man just a few years later in 1973. I like how there was the implication of some sort of vampire theme, though I wish it would have been touched on a little more. Of course, the landlord's name is Stoker, which I'm sure was an ode to the author Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula. I couldn't find any reviews of the movie from news articles in 1971, though, and I'm unsure why. I couldn't find anything else when I looked for 1972 either, so I don't know. I'm not sure what other people might have thought when the movie originally came out. But I give this movie a 3.5 out of 5 stars. Truly. And just for reference, in case anyone was curious, I watched this on Fossum. So maybe like when this first comes out and you're watching this video, head on over there if you want to check it out. That's it. That's all I have to say.